Let's launch into this because this time I know is going to go very quickly. So the purpose for today's meeting is to be able to teach basic college admission tips and tricks, college admission tests. I'm sorry, I forgot that word. Tips and tricks to high school students, including knowing how to do fast math. And we're going to also talk about how the SAT and ACT math is not like the math that you learn per se, or not how you're taught to take a math test in class. Um, Backfilling, which is a math tip, choose your number, and active reading. So you'll notice from this list that 3 out of the 4 of them deal with math tips, um, because that's really the one that tends to be the section that students have the most difficulty with and have the most anxiety about. Again, because it's so different from how they're taught to do math for most students. And then the active reading and the English portion, which is really grammar specific, that tends to be either remediation or just teaching for the first time skills, like how to use commas correctly or colons or semicolons, what's an ambiguous pronoun, and really reviewing those skills rather than say like actual tips or tricks. And if there's anything that you feel like I forgot or whatnot, feel free to chime in. I'm not trying to be a talking head, so you guys are welcome to ask questions or comment throughout. So just again, a real quick recap of stuff that I covered briefly in the other presentation. So these are the 2 books that I tend to lean towards and lean on. I used to be a big Kaplan user until College Board, which actually creates the SAT as well as AP tests. They started printing their own books. So there's no reason to use something that's not actually created by the test makers. So that's why we use the College Board. They're the ones who write the test, probably the most legitimate source for test questions when they're the one writing the test. And then same thing with the SAT guide. So these tend to be the places where we start. Both of them have a lot of practice tests, and that's really also the important part when you're picking out materials is I've found, like with Kaplan, it's like this thick. It's almost, it feels like it's as wide as my head. And the reason is because half of it, if not maybe a little bit more, deals with like their strategies. So it would be for a student, if they were going to read the pages cover to cover, they would have half that would read them through the strategies and then the other half a practice test. Well, when you are working with somebody like a Beyond Education mentor, that half that covers the strategies, you're talking through and doing with the person. So you really don't need all 400 pages of what Kaplan would include. So I just felt like it was a waste of time and a waste of paper with those particular books. So now I really focus on books that have as many practice tests and practice problems as possible, because that's the crux of the prep, is just doing lots of practice. Updates on the differences. And again, I'll give you guys access to the PDF that it's an infographic from another test prep company that I think did a fabulous job putting together all the information on the differences between the two. So I'll give you guys access to those. It's also discussed in the first video, but just updates. So as of 2021, College Board, which does the SAT, is no longer doing subject tests, which for students who are applying to Ivy League schools or like engineering specific schools that would typically require a math test, this is a big deal, and because they no longer need them. And there's no longer an essay section as of this summer, which for college admissions, you know, my kind of input to students before this was always, you have to at least take the essay section once, and then after that, it doesn't really matter, because almost every school has come out and almost every college has come out in the last 5 years and said, you know what, really and honestly, we're not looking at the essay section because we're not judging you based on your skill to create an essay in 40 minutes. We want you to be a critical thinker, and we know that that takes longer than 40 minutes to create an idea and whatnot. So I'm glad that they dropped that section because many colleges weren't recognizing it anyway. ACT, this is really huge, although I haven't seen it in real life yet because of COVID and all the issues they've had with testing. So the ACT, just as of 2020, ACT is allowing students to retest for single sections once they've taken a whole test. So once you've taken a full ACT, and let's say you want to improve your math score, you should be allowed to just go and sign up for a math section retest. I've had some students who have told me that they've tried to do that and it's not available quite yet. I haven't gone in and looked to see if it's now available. Again, because COVID, it was such a mess, and then trying to coordinate everything that I think it was just too much for them to manage at the test sites. But this should be available, which is huge. I would suspect that the College Board is going to add this option soon because they tend to just follow the ACT. Now, Katie and Maddie, when you guys took the ACT and the SAT, I believe that was after the revision. So the SAT and the ACT looked pretty similar. Is that right?
I think it had just been revised because I think it switched back to the 1600 scale right before we
But
took it.
on yours, when you took the SAT, was there just one section of English, one section of reading, and then the math calculator, math non-calculator?
Like no essay, you mean?
Not no essay, but it wasn't like one little math, then one little reading, then one little English, then another math and another English. That had already gone away, correct?
I can't remember. Maybe Katie does.
Okay, it's okay.
Mine was the like one section of reading, one
Okay.
section of English. Yeah.
I've been doing this for so long, I can't remember. So evidently, long ago, the SAT again followed suit with the ACT by doing a major revision. And now the two tests are pretty similar, which is nice because one of the biggest questions that'll come up from families, parents, and students is which test should I take? And because they're so similar in formatting now, which was not the case 7 or 8 years ago, it's really easy to say, you know what, we can take both. And you can even go through the infographic with them and kind of show them, okay, well, just so you know, the SAT tends to be a little bit harder in the English portion, a little bit more advanced, but the math section of the ACT tends to have a little bit more geometry. But overall, the formatting of the two are very similar now. So a lot of times I'll tell parents or students who ask, which one should I take? I'll say, you know what, it's pretty normal for students to take both tests if you want to. And a lot of students feel like they need to take both because a lot of their peers are taking both. And the nice thing is that the formatting, besides the math section, besides the math and the science section, are identical. So whatever we're studying in the SAT English and reading is going to carry over to your ACT English and reading, and the math skills are relatively interchangeable, although they may need to do some fine tuning here and there. So that's the nice thing about the two tests is they're pretty similar. Okay, any questions about anything that was mentioned? Okay, cool. I'm going to keep rolling here. All right, so let's go to the next page. All right, so we're just going to jump right into math section tips. Like I said, the math section tends to be the one that most students are terrified of and struggle with the most. One of the main reasons is because the way you take, and Monica, you may have realized this when you were taking it on your road trip, the way you take a math section of the SAT or an ACT is totally different for the most part than how you're taught to take a math test. So I don't know about you guys, but when I was taught to take a math test, I had to show all of my steps. They had to be in perfect order. I had to show all of my work. And if the teacher was really nice, I would get partial credit, even if I didn't get the final answer right. SAT and ACT math is not like that at all. You want to get to the answer as fast as you possibly can. And it really doesn't matter. As long as your math is solid, you don't have to show the steps. I don't care how you got there. I just want the final answer. So for a lot of students, I find who have just been ingrained, it's been ingrained in them to like, you have to do it this way. Even myself, like I've had to untrain myself of doing it in a very methodical way. It's untraining the student or helping them to realize nobody cares how you got to this answer. As long as your math is sound, you can get there however you want, which for those kids who have gotten penalized their entire life in math class because teachers have hounded them or given them terrible grades for not including all the steps perfectly, this is their time to shine. You can be like, hey, let's do those things, which I have a student who is like that. he always gets to an answer in a way where I'm like, wait, how did you get there? It's the right answer, but he approaches it in such a different way. And every time he does that, I'm thinking, wow, you are going to be stellar at SAT or ACT math because you can get to the answer really quickly. So it's about time, and it's about how do you get there as fast as possible. The basics. So being able to do quick mental math is a big plus on SAT and ACT math sections. If you don't have to waste time writing out X to the third to the fifth is this, you're going to save yourself time. And I know not everybody in this group may opt to do the math section, but I think it's helpful for everybody to at least know about it. So even if you're just going to focus on the humanities, the English and the reading portion, you can at least speak to the math section if someone was to have questions about it. So it's really important to be able to do quick mental math, again, time, and to see patterns, which I believe I included some problems in here today where you can see some patterns. You'll start to do enough problems, and that's the thing with just repetition and doing as many problems and practice tests as possible. You'll start to see patterns of like, oh yeah, I know this question. This is the system of equations question. They want me to do it this way, and I know I can get there fastest this way. So that's really key. The two main kind of tips and tricks in the math section is backfilling and choose your own number. They can't be applied for every question. There's a handful of questions, which we're going to go through some today, where you can use them, and they tend to just help a little bit. It's not necessarily like you have to shove it down your student's throat of like, you must backfill or you must choose your own number, but there are definitely some questions where it makes the problems easier. And part of it is just helping their brain to rewire and think, oh yeah, let me choose my own number here. Okay, so we're going to launch right in at 9:21 in the morning to some SAT math. So here is a question that you may choose your number. So on Saturday afternoon, Armand sent N text messages each hour for 5 hours, and Tyrone sent P text messages each hour for 4 hours. Which of the following represents the total number of messages sent by Armand and Tyrone on Saturday afternoon? Now, if you're a math whiz, you may not need to choose your own number because you can kind of see what they're asking here. Probably going to be multiplication. I just need to multiply stuff together. For the students who, again, have math anxiety or just general anxiety about taking this test, it helps students to not think in abstract terms, meaning variables. So if we can give them concrete numbers to work with, that tends to help them find the answer quicker. So a way I put try it on your own, but we'll do this one together. So a way that you could choose your own number here, because if you look at the responses, they all still have variables in them, right? So I'm having to think in abstract because these aren't numbers. If instead I was to choose my own number and I said, all right, let me just make up a number. Usually I tell students pick small numbers. 5 and 7 are actually a little bit bigger. Usually I just go 1 and 2, but still relatively small. So let's just say that Armand sent 5 messages each hour for 5 hours, and that Tyrone sent 7 messages each hour for 4 hours. Which of the following represents the total number of messages? Okay, now I can think Armand is sending 5 messages every hour for 5 hours. Okay, I know that's going to be 25 because it's 5 times 5. How did I get there? I multiplied. Same thing for Tyrone. 7 times 4. I multiplied. So my answer here would be 25 times 28 would be, and this is a calculator question, would be 700. 2 ways you can do this. So if your student wants to calculate this number and say 700, then what you would tell them of how backfilling works, oops, sorry. Seems low, yeah. What you would tell them for, choose your number is you would say, all right, if 700 is what you got when you set m equal to 5 and p equal to 7, you want to go and set m equal to 5 and p equal to 7 for each one of these answer options and see which one will give you 700. Now, you should be able to eliminate option C and D really quickly because nowhere in your math, when you were doing it, did you do any, it was only multiplication. So you should be able to eliminate these really quickly. which gets your chances now to a 50-50 chance instead of a 25% chance that you're getting the answer right. And then you can see here, right? I could plug in M and P with the numbers I got, see which one I got 700. Or I can also see in my math, I just multiplied 5 and 4 together and M and P, so my answer would be B. Does that make sense how I explain that? It's kind of early for a Thursday in the summer.
Though, I feel like you should add those. Am I misunderstanding the question?
Are these two?
Yeah, I would say that the answer is 5 and plus 14.
No, you're right. I did this too quickly. No, you're not crazy. You would add them. Sorry. This is the problem with doing math too early on a summer. Yes. Thank you for correcting me. So apologies. I got this math wrong. So A and B, we should be able to eliminate. And it was C or D. And so then it's just making sure you're getting the 5 associated with the M correctly and the 4 associated with the P. Thank you, Monica, for catching that. And by the way, here's a great vulnerable moment of every so often you might work out a problem and then have to be like, okay, wait, let's backtrack. Got ahead of myself. Okay, does that make sense? Again, this may be a problem where the student might be able to see it really easily, but I have had students where even this type of problem, they need to be able to plug in a number to really make sense of it. Let me update this because that's going to make it. Can't hear anything. I'm going to move on. All right, so moving on, and hopefully y'all will catch me if I make any other errors. If I can find what slide I was on. Here we go. Okay, so here is another one. Now, I'll read it and then I'll ask you the question. So if x is greater than 3, which of the following is equivalent to 1 over x plus 2 plus 1 over x plus 3? Does anybody want to guess why a student would freak out about this question? Or have a little panic attack? Anybody?
Probably because it's like an inequality that you're given, like x is greater than 3, so you don't have an actual number, and then the answer choices just seem kind of like super random. So
they seem super random, and also there's a fraction within a fraction, which most students who are coming in not feeling strong about their math tend to also feel really uncomfortable with fractions, tend to not like fractions. So a fraction within a fraction problem, most students are going to look at this and be like, oh gosh. And yes, adding in the fact that there's also an inequality. So Maddie, tell me, if you were going to choose your own number here, how do you think you might approach this?
I would probably go with 4, just because like it's the smallest number you can use, and just start plugging it into all of them.
Yeah. So I would just add, I would definitely choose 4. I think that's even what I put in the next one. Yeah. And I would plug it in to my original function and I would combine them. Now I'm pretty sure that this is a non-calculator question. So if we assume that, so the SAT, remember, has a calculator portion and a non-calculator portion. The ACT, you can use your calculator for the whole thing. So on the SAT, if this was a non-calculator question, you're having to do this, either writing it down or mentally. If this is a calculator question, then it could be easier as long as you put the parentheses in the right place. For all of us who are used to our calculator getting the wrong answer when we don't put parentheses where they need to be. But assuming that this is non-calculator, yes, I would plug the 4 in, solve the problem. And I'm going to do this with you guys because I actually didn't solve it yet. So I'll give it a minute or so to solve it and then look to see what would be the correct answer. So I'm going to give you guys a second to do it while I do it with you. Did anybody solve using 4? What you all got? Anybody wants to share?
It'd be 13.
You got 13 even?
Yeah. So when you have a fraction under a fraction, you can just flip it so the x plus 3 and the x plus 2 just go on top.
Okay. Is everyone relatively done? Just checking the work here. That's something different now because I missed that question. I'm triple checking. Did anybody get anything different than you said you got 13, Monica? Everybody get the same answer?
Monica, could you explain what you did?
Yeah, so whenever you have fractions in your denominator, you can always just flip it. So the 1 over x plus 2 will just simply be x plus 2. So to simplify that term, it just becomes x plus 2 plus x plus 3. I wasn't sure about it because, I mean, it's been a long time. So basically what I did is I did 1 over 1/4. And so if you think it that way, it's 1 divided by 0.25, which would just give you 4. So 1 over 1/4 would just simply equal 4. And that's how I would explain it to a student. So that term, even though it looks complicated, it just equals x plus 2 plus x plus 3. So it would just simplify to 2x plus 5.
Now, I used a similar premise, but got something a little bit different because I dealt with the fraction and the fractions in the denominator first before flipping it, and said that if you chose 4, you would get in the denominator you would get 1/6 plus 1/7,
Right.
which
So
then
that
if
would
you dealt with that, it would be 13 over 42.
I mean, that would equal just 13. It might have rounded. I don't know.
Well, but the 1/6 plus 1/7, you'd have to do a common denominator. I'm sorry, the 7/6 plus 6.
So it would be
1/6 plus 1/7 to combine. You'd have to get a common denominator, which would give you 7 over 42 plus 6 over 42, which would give you 13 over 42, and then you flip it. Tell me if you're seeing that.
Yeah, I see that, but
let me see if I can.
Yeah, I think maybe you are right. I guess like if there wasn't that addition, then you could just simply flip it, but because there's an addition sign, what I was thinking was wrong.
Yeah, it's all good. This is the beauty of working together.
And it does the cobwebs. So yeah, I guess you'd have to find a common denominator before you flip it.
Yeah, and there have been, so in full honesty, guys, this is also a good reminder why when you're going in, especially as you're getting started with students, I would recommend, because unfortunately this has happened to me before, where I have I'm I've seen every type of SAT question, and then I go in and do some prep with a student, and we get that one question where it's a little bit weird and it's a little bit different approach, or I forget whatever the math is, and I'm like struggling to figure it out and to work it out. And I'll be really honest with the student at that time and say, okay, let me go back and just look at their solutions and see how they do that. And like, oh, okay, this makes sense. But as you're getting started with a student, especially if this is some of your first couple of sessions, those type of moments can be a time where the student maybe loses some confidence in you. Like, okay, wait, if Lara doesn't know how to do this and she's supposed to be the expert, like to say me. So I highly recommend, and I'm telling this to myself as well, to prepare for the session and just look over all of the questions just to make sure that you know how you would approach it. Because again, whether it's, you just didn't drink enough coffee that day, or our brains are wired, like me especially, my brain is wired to think of math problems in a very methodical way. And I have had to untrain it when doing SAT or ACT math. And so I need to look at a problem and jump to it in a different pattern. So it's just good for me to look at it. Or it's just one of those weird problems that they throw in the mix, and it's putting together, geometry principles or trig principles in a way that I just haven't thought of. It's good to just be prepared for it. So that way you don't get caught off guard. So with this, Katie and Madeline, did you guys get a solution? Were you trying it?
I had gotten 13. Oh,
Sorry, go ahead, Maddie.
sorry. I had gotten 13 too, but I realized why that's wrong.
Okay. And Maddie?
That was Maddie. After we no, you're good. After we just decided that 13 was incorrect, I went through it again. So I think the answer is B.
Yeah, I agree. It's B. So you were right when you said it was 42 over 13.
Yeah, it's all good. All good. All right. So here we go. So that's one where you could choose your number. Now, again, there may be some students who can work with the variables and they don't necessarily need to choose a number. And in that case, if they can jump it and switch correctly and whatnot, great. But a lot of times, and you guys will figure this out really quickly as you're working with students and just their confidence in whatever the subject area is, it helps to have concrete numbers. So like using a 4 or something like that. And I didn't say this at the beginning of this question, but making sure that you're abiding by whatever the restrictions are that they put on the question. So for this question, it has to be greater than 3. So making sure you're picking 4, because if you choose 1 or something like that, then the solution may not work. All right, let's move on. Okay, here's another question, and I actually made this presentation a little bit math heavy, so we may skip through some ones just so that we get to all of the sections. But here is another one for what value of n is the absolute value of n minus 1 plus 1 equal to 0. Now, you could easily solve this question, right? You could set it equal to 0 and then remind the student when you're doing absolute value, you have to do duplicates. Or you could also just plug in these answers, because one of these has to be the answer, right? So I could go and plug in 0, I could go and plug in 1, I could go and plug in 2 and find the answer. Or I could say there's no such value, which in this case, 0 minus 1 would give me absolute value of 1 plus 1, that's 2, so it's not that. 1 minus 1 is 0 plus 1, that's 1, not equal to 0. 2 minus 1 is 1, so we would see, hey, there's no such value of n. So this would be, and I'm sorry, this would be backfilling. So this is the second of the 2 strategies. So this is backfilling, where they give you the answers that they give you are concrete numbers. So in this case, 0, 1, 2, or a no answer. One of these has to be the answer, so you go and plug it into the simple equation. I'm finding that there's less of these questions on the SAT and ACT math because they're relatively simple. But it's still a good strategy to have. And that's usually something that I remind the student of, is just to be aware of the fact that you're happy to do one of the four, right? So if there's a way where you can either eliminate answer options and maybe get it down to two, it's like your basic multiple choice test taking strategies, right? If I can eliminate two of these options really quickly, great, now I have a 50-50 chance instead of a 25% or a 33%, like I'm upping the likelihood that I'm gonna get this right. Or if you can backfill, like this is really easy for me, hey, these have to be correct, so let me just plug these in. Any tools where you can increase the likelihood that you're going to get it right and you can do it quickly is a good strategy to use. So this is another one. So a food truck sells salads for $6.50 each and drinks for $2 each. The food truck's revenue from selling a total of 209 salads and drinks in one day was $836.50. How many salads were sold that day? Okay. Before we jump into trying this on your own, and actually I think we're going to keep blazing through this, so we might come back to it later if we have some time. One, this is a system of equations problem, which is a very typical type of question. You have a lot of these on both SAT and ACT math, but I see a lot of them come up in SAT math, where you have the cost of two items, so in this case, salads and drinks, and I have the total amount or quantity of salads and drinks that were sold, and so I can use either elimination or substitution to find what was the amount that were sold for each. The other part for this one that we haven't talked about yet, make sure that the student is answering the question being asked. So in this case, it's not very tricky, but there are some that are trickier. In this case, it wants to know how many salads were sold that day. So if you're doing a system of equations problem, you're naturally going to solve for two things. So in this case, I'm going to naturally solve for salads and drinks. But again, if I'm at the same time, I just need to solve for salads. So make sure that I'm solving for whatever they're asking for, and don't waste time solving for the other thing, because this isn't a math test. The teacher isn't looking for all your work and for you to do all of the problems, or to do all of the components, I should say. Another really common thing, and I didn't include it in a particular set of questions that I chose, is it's really common for them to not ask like, what is X, but instead to ask, what is the difference between X and 5? Or to ask for like another ancillary part of the question. So a lot of times that's where it's pointing out to the student, hey, what are they actually asking you to solve for? Because it may not be the straightforward solve for X. It may actually be the difference between two variables or the product between two variables. Difference tends to be the most common one. So, and they'll usually be jerks and include in your multiple choice if you just solve for X and didn't do the other part of it. So I guarantee if we go through and solve this, one of these solutions is going to be the answer if you solve for number of drinks. So if you forget that you're solving for salads or don't set your equation up right, you could probably choose the other component of this and be like, yes, I'm doing great, when in reality you solved for the wrong item. Oops. Okay. Again, if I don't hear anything, I'm going to assume everything's good. Okay, so that is math. So we talked a little bit about choosing your own number. We talked just briefly about backfilling. Like I said, there's not as many backfilling questions on here anymore. They're just a little bit too easy, but they might throw you a couple to be nice. We talked about going through as quick as possible. And I might make some more videos later and just record them to send them your guys' way of questions that I find that are just really great examples of how you have to not do it the way your math teacher taught you. But as you go through problems, you'll start to see like, okay, yeah, I'm trying to work out all these problems and write all my questions, and I don't need to do that. I don't need to show that 4 times 7 is 42. I can just jump to it. And you'll find you'll have students who want to go through the steps because that's how they've been trained. And we just have to dismantle that a little bit for this test. I would say another thing to note on all of these sections is timing, right? And working on the student with timing. I don't know if any of you guys remember if there was any particular sections where you had to really work on making sure that you got it done in time. I think math was, even though I was in advanced math, which ended up kind of hurting me because I had to go back and learn a lot of the algebra principles they put on there. I'm pretty sure I had to work on my timing in the math section because I would always spend too much time, and I didn't have anybody who told me not to approach it like a math class. So I did all of my math problems like my math teacher taught me. But just being really cognizant with your student, whether it's the English, the reading, the math section, or in the ACT, the science section, about are you getting through all of the problems with enough time? And so one of the things that I'll tend to do as we get through maybe 3 to 5, maybe 6 sessions, and I feel like, okay, we've gone through the basics enough and drilled on it enough that now let's integrate the time component, because that's really the other big hurdle of this test. As you guys all know, it's a 3+ hour test, right? And so keeping our brains on and active for that long is really hard for a lot of humans, not just juniors in high schools, juniors in high school who are taking this. So a lot of the prep is actually just building up our brain stamina to be able to last and keep our brain on that long. So it's something that I usually mention with any student that I work with for SAT and ACT. Does anybody have any horror stories to share or exhaustion stories of how to do that, or what it felt like when you guys went through it? No? Okay. All right. Well, if you think of any, feel free to share. We can have a ACT and SAT therapy session after this. So the next part is the English section, which in the ACT, it's called the English section. In the SAT, it's called the Writing in English section. Both of these, again, the nice part is when they did their revision 7+ years ago, the SAT English section now looks identical to the ACT English section. They're both grammar based, so that makes it really easy to prep. They used to be significantly different, and so you had to teach 2 totally different tactics, but now they are identical. So this section, Meredith, this is where you're going to be more excited. This section is grammar based, so it's knowing how to use a comma, what's the right homonym to choose, there, or there. Do I use it's with an apostrophe or it's without an apostrophe? Knowing which transitional words to use, like additionally or however or consequently. There's also organization components, like should I add a sentence in here? If I was to add a sentence in here, what should it be? How does this link together? So for the English section, it tends to be with students recognizing where their voids are in their grammar knowledge and then filling in those gaps. And so there's not necessarily so many tips, I would say, as opposed to the reading section, which we're going to look at after this. The English section is one where you want to answer the question as you're reading through it. So this is a first paragraph of a passage. So in this one, the passage is called The Triangular Snowflake. So you see snowflakes form from tiny water droplets following a specific process of chemical bonding as they freeze, which results in a 6-sided figure. All right, so they have this underlined portion. You want to stop and answer the question as you're reading it. Not necessarily the case for the reading section, which we'll talk about in a little bit, but I would stop and try and answer this. Okay, should I have no change? Should this change to form, comma, from tiny, comma, water droplets, comma? So if I'm looking at my 3 options here, you can see pretty quickly, if you're a visual learner, that the difference between these answers are where I'm putting the commas. So my original, which the first answer is always going to be no change. My original has the comma after droplets. This other option has a comma splice where it's snowflakes form, comma, from tiny water droplets, or form from tiny water droplets with no comma, with an extra comma here. And then you see comma here, but no comma in between. So it's testing to see, hey, do you remember that between 2 adjectives that are sandwiched together, you have to have a comma? And then do I need a comma splice? That's what this question is asking. Meredith, what would you choose in this section? Snowflakes form from tiny water droplets following a specific process of chemical bonding as they freeze. Odd one. I'll tell you.
Yeah, I think A.
A.
I'm kind of like squinting to see. I'm sorry.
Oh, to see it? No, you're fine. So it is A. It is no change.
Yeah.
And it is, yep, because you would need to break this up. So for some students, they would typically see it. This is one where it's also a good strategy, and I guess I could have included this as a strategy, but it'll kind of just come naturally to most of us to read it out loud and to hear it, right? So if we know a comma is where you take a breath and you kind of pause, then if you read this kind of taking those pauses, then you'll pick it up pretty quickly. And that's something that I'll go through with students, is just like getting good at hearing your own voice when you're reading this out loud. Now, when you're in a testing situation, you don't want to be reading this out loud. So maybe getting good at hearing your voice in your head, or maybe whispering it really quietly, but you'll tend to hear the correction there. So let me just go to this page where I already marked all the answers. So the next one, you can see by the answer choices that this is understanding the transition. So for example, additionally and however, those are three very different openers. I can't remember the specific word for it. It's not conjunctions, but there's another word for it that you would use. And so for number two, you would read through it and see, okay, how do these phrases, the rare triangular snowflake and the confounded scientist for years because it apparently trephined, blah, 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 how do those two relate? So in this case, they're converse of each other, right? So I should have a however there. So if you're doing the English or what's called the writing section, depending on the test you're taking, it's really just having an assessment of your students' grammar skills and what they're comfortable with, and then filling in voids where they need maybe some more support there. I'll have some students who will breeze through this, and they, we really don't have to spend much time on it. And so I'm more so just giving them practice to do in their spare time and just checking in on them, but maybe I'm not spending really much of our session time focusing on it. And then there's other students where we have to spend a significant amount of time on it, and we're using maybe supplement stuff where I'll go on Google and search, comma practice worksheets, and we're doing that. There also, if you have a student like that, there's a couple like grammar books that I've ordered on Amazon and have supplemented with students, but it really just depends on the student and what they need. Any questions on this guy?
With the practice SAT books, do they go into explanations of the answers? Because like I do well on the grammar questions, it's just not where I can necessarily why.
Yeah.
I know the answer, but I'm not sure like what the grammar rule is.
Yep. Yeah, and that's a great example, right? I couldn't remember what this word was for these terms, but yes, on both of the books that we use, these guys, both of them have explanations for every problem. One of them, I think it's the ACT one, only has the solutions with the explanation, which is kind of irritating when you're trying to just grade it really quickly. And then the other one has one page where it's just all the answers, A, B, C, D, da, 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 in order. And then the next part is going through every question and telling you why this answer is correct and why the other ones aren't. Cool. All right, let's see. Okay, so there are the English sections. So the reading section tips. So the reading section is very similar, ACT and SAT, almost identical. That infographic, and let me actually pull it up just to look at it together, that talks about the differences between the two. does claim that on average, the SAT reading section, reading comprehension, is at a higher level than the ACT. Actually, here, I can pull it up right here. I think I can drag it in. Yeah, okay. Here's the PDF that I keep referencing. Like I said, I'll share this with you guys. So if we go down, they break it down just by timing and scoring, and then they go through each section. So if we look at reading, SAT has 52 questions, ACT has 40. Vocabulary, the SAT definitely hits on it, drives it home harder. For those of us who took it 10 years ago, Monica and I, you might remember where we had to do SAT vocab drills, to get our vocab up, because they had like 10 questions in total that were just vocabulary and synonyms, which I hated because vocabulary was not necessarily my strength. They took that out, so it's all vocab and context now. So it's less, I don't encourage students to do any vocab drills anymore. It's really not necessary. We'll talk about this in a little bit when we get to the science part about does it include graphs and charts. But you can see passage complexity wise, the SAT tends to be a little bit more complex. And according to this Flesch-Kincaid test or readability assessment, the SAT tends to be on a higher reading level than the ACT. So that's something to just keep in mind. Before I switch back, another thing to note for the SAT and the ACT, each one of them have a set number of passages. So this is something that I feel like a lot of students don't use, but it's one of those skills where as you just do more practice, it becomes second nature. If you know that you're going into a reading section that has 5 sections and that one of them is going to be a compare contrast and the other 4 are going to be long passages, and I know that I'm going to have 1 literature, 2 history and social studies 1, and 2 sciences, then I could potentially get to the point where I can triage, meaning I can go through and say, okay, I know the science section tend to be the easiest ones for me because I'm a science brain. So let me go to the science ones first, knock those out, and then come back and do the prose ones or whatnot. I have very few students who get to that level where they're thinking about it in that way and triaging in that way, but I think it's a great skill, especially if there is a huge disparity in their strengths in the particular type of reading passage to be able to triage. Same thing with the ACT. I know one of them is going to be prose, one of them is going to be social science, one of them is going to be humanities, one of them is going to be natural science. So if I know I tend to do better in 1 or 2 of them and not so strong in the other 2, let's do the 2 strong ones first. That way I'm getting the questions right that I tend to get right. And I'm leaving the questions for the ones that I tend to struggle on or it takes more mental capacity. I'm leaving those for last so that I'm efficiently using my brain. And in every reading passage, and I don't know if I grabbed a picture of one, I didn't, but I think I can pull one up too. Every reading passage will be clearly labeled. Let me bring it up real quick. I didn't grab a photo of this. Every reading passage will clearly be labeled with what type of passage it is. If not, you can figure it out really quickly by the little blurb that they give you. So let me go here. I will show you real quick. Okay, so this is SAT practice test, which is pulled down off of College Board and Khan Academy's website. Since they partnered up, they now have, I believe it's 6 free tests. Oops, I'm just zooming on past it. So I can tell pretty quickly what type of passage this is for the SAT, just based on this little blurb at the top. So it says, this passage is adapted from Francis J. Flynn and Gabrielle S. Adams' Money Can't Buy Love, Asymmetric Beliefs About Gift Price and Feelings of Appreciation. So if I know that the SAT has literature, history, social studies, and science, I'm going to bet based on that description that it's probably a social studies. Doesn't really sound like a literature. Whereas if I go back up to this passage, it says, this is from Lydia Minatoya, The Strangeness of Beauty by Lydia Minatoya. The setting is in Japan in 1920. Chi and her daughter Naomi are members of the House of Fuji, a noble family. This sounds like it's probably going to be a prose or a narrative, so more of like a literature based. In the ACT, they label it even more directly, so you know exactly what you're reading. So that's something where I didn't make a note on here, but I'll go back and update this. That's actually a reading test skill that a lot of students don't necessarily focus on, is reading these little blurbs so that you know what you're about to head into. I know I'm about to head into a literature type question, or I know I'm about to head into a science passage. And that way my brain is just ready to go. It's primed. So I'm going to skip ahead and then come back to this. So the type of reading questions that you will tend to see on the SAT or the ACT. So you have your big picture questions, which is like, what was the point of this passage? What was this about? You have your detail questions. So in line 59, when so-and-so said this, what did they mean? Your inference questions, which is your typical, what can be inferred when the author said this or the way that they said this. Function questions, which should actually be a subpoint. So a function question example would be, what's the purpose or effect of this paragraph or line? Vocabulary and context. And you will, I've found that now after I've read enough passages, I can start to kind of anticipate what vocabulary words they're more likely gonna ask in the questions. That's a great skill if your teacher, if your student can start to pick that up. They've done enough passages where they read past a word and they're like, oh, they're probably gonna ask me about this word. But that comes from, I find, a lot of practice. Analogy questions. An example of that is this one. The experts line X would most likely argue that which of the following is guilty of sin mentioned in line. So you're asked to compare a text from the passage to an external experience or example that they're giving you. Author technique, evidence support questions, and data reasoning questions. So I pulled this off of, I meant to put the website in here. I'll have to go and do that. I'm not plagiarizing. This is a breakdown from another test prep blog that I found that seemed about accurate. So if you look at the breakdown, the majority of the questions, a little over a fifth, are big picture questions, and then little detail, inference, function. Oh, I'm sorry. And then evidence support down here is the other fifth. And then the rest of it is distributed between the other 7 types of questions. So an evidence support question, I believe I captured one in this picture. We can see, so like line 18, that's a vocabulary and context. As it's used in line 19, the phrase paid out most nearly means. So this is going back to the passage and just substituting the words in and seeing which one makes the most sense. According to the passage, the mountain range in Atlanta's basin covers nearly the same amount of Earth's surface as does whatnot. According to the passage, so these are specific detail questions, right? They're saying according to the passage. Here's the main purpose, a purpose question. The main purpose of this information is what? I did not pull out the question that backs it up, but where you would have an example of the evidence support question would be like if they asked, according to the passage, the mountain range of Atlanta's basin covers nearly the same amount of blah, you would pick the answer here. Then the next question would be, choose the line or lines that support this answer. So it's usually a 2-for-1. And you would think, that if the student misses the first part, that they always miss the second part. It's not always. Occasionally, I'll have a student who gets the first or misses the first part and still somehow picks the second part correctly, which I think is just kind of funny. But it's a connected question where one will ask you for the answer and the next question will ask you for the support, and they'll never place it where like the first question would be 13 asking you for it, and then question 19 would be where they ask you for support. It's always going to be back to back. One thing that I didn't put in here, I mentioned at the very beginning, but I forgot to put a slide dedicated to it. So with the reading comprehension, We talked a little bit about the triaging. And then the other part is just active reading and fast reading. So I mentioned in the grammar section, which is the writing section, that you want to answer the question as you're reading the passage. It's very common that I'll have students ask, well, should I go and read the questions first and then go back and read the passage and like look for them as I'm going through? If I have a student who really pushes back on this technique, I will have them do 2 passages and have one passage where they go and read the questions first and then read the passage and then answer the questions, versus just read the passage through and then answer the questions. 99.999% of the time, it takes more time to read the questions, then read the passage, then come back and answer the questions. I think I maybe had one student who was about equal time. And even then he figured out, I'm probably just trying to make this harder than I need to. So with the reading section, as opposed to the grammar section, in order to finish the section in the time allotted, students should really read the passage as quickly and as efficiently as they can, and then do the questions immediately after. I find that as students get better at that, and depending on their ability to hold information long enough, if they read it efficiently, then the information stays fresh enough to where they can answer these pretty quickly without having to go back and refer. Another tool that I learned when I was actually doing some grad school test prep a long time ago, when I thought I was going to go to med school, is to be an active reader, right? So, and this is a technique I find I have to encourage and teach students more than we might assume. So to follow the line with their pen or with their pencil, because they'll have a pencil in the test, to follow it with it so that they're staying engaged and that they don't just zone out. And then to take little notes on paragraphs or sections, so that when a question asks, hey, when they talk about, so the one that we pulled up was about a mountain, when they talk about Mount St. Helens, what did they mean when they said this? Well, if you were someone who was taking notes and there was a section that was clearly about Mount St. Helens and you wrote just MT SH or something, or scribbled Mount St. Helens next to it, to jump to that paragraph right away and to look for your answer there. So it allows you to locate the information a lot faster. And I found that to be a huge help in, again, being able to jump back and forth between the questions and where to find the answers. Something that I used to have to tell students that I don't find I'm having to say as much anymore, but occasionally will come up, is students who try to overly analyze the passage. Which I think they've really updated the question so that it's less common to do this now. But when there used to be questions like, well, what do you think the author's trying to say? Or what would they agree with this? They would include responses that would overly analyze the passage, that would allow the student to make an inference that goes too far beyond the scope of the passage, which if you've taken, if you've had really great English teachers and you've had to analyze literature and, think way beyond the scope of the passage and say, well, what's the so what of this and how does it apply to the world? Then you've been trained to think outside the passage and to have this big, like, well, this is how it applies to human nature. The SAT and the ACT they're not going to expect you, nor do they want you to think beyond the scope of the passage. The answer will always be within the passage. You should never have to draw upon your own experience or your own inferences. So you might find as you go through some of the answer options, like, oh, okay, I could see where C seems like it would be a really great answer, but the answer tends to be B. It might be because C is over inferring or outside the scope of the passage. And even though if we were writing a paper on this for our AP English class, it would be great, they want the answer that has to do with the passage. And again, I'll go in and find an example of that. They're less common now, thankfully, with the revisions that they've done. So I find myself not having to mention that as much, whereas it used to be something that I like hounded on all the time. But if I come across one, I'll send it to you. So reading section, active reading, reading the entire passage, then answering the questions, not going back and forth like you would in the English section. Having some familiarity with the question types. I don't tend to drill students per se on knowing all 9 question types. I haven't found that that tends to be really, really helpful, but maybe just knowing that there are and then moving on and moving forward. Unless you find a student, you know, just always struggles with, let's say, the evidence support questions, but does great with the other 8 types of questions, then it might be helpful for them to just be able to say like, oh, this is an evidence support question. I need to be really focused on this one. So triaging, active reading, I think those are really the 2 big things with reading sections. Are there any tips or tricks that you all have used in the past that have helped you with reading comprehension portions like this that maybe I didn't cover?
While I was doing the reading section last week, what really helped me is some of the ones where I really didn't know what the answer was, that the next question was, where do you find the evidence? Skipping and kind of, using the evidence, like answer choices, kind of helps you have a clue of what the right answer is, because there's only going to be 1 or 2 that kind of pair up and make sense. So on a couple of the ones I wasn't sure about, that kind of helped me go back and like figure out what the first question's answer was based on what the options of the evidence were.
Totally. Yeah, I think that's great. And the other things, I'm going to try and put this on while I remember. This weird thing, I'll come back to that. Okay. Cool. All right. So, okay, so the last part is science section. So in the ACT, there is a dedicated science section. In the SAT, there is science questions sprinkled throughout the English, the reading, and the math section. And what that looks like are charts or graphs. So I'll show you. Yep, here's one right here. So we're in the reading comprehension section. And this is in one of, we read this title before. So this is a social science passage. It's not even a science passage. And they've included a graph. And so they're going to ask a dedicated question that asks the students to analyze this graph and interpret it. That's what the SAT science questions look like. Whereas the ACT has an entire section devoted to just science passages. So when we talk about guiding students or directing them into picking one over the other, for the students who really have anxiety or feel like they're not strong in science, maybe you've done some of the science questions and you're not really seeing the improvement, because we'll talk about how it's not necessarily science that they're testing, then that's when I'm going to really push them to focus more on the SAT. When they really just struggle with the science passages, then we probably shouldn't take the test that has an entire section devoted to science. And by the way, it's the last section besides the essay of the test. So again, for a student who doesn't feel strong in science, if you've just now taken 2.5 hours of a really mentally strenuous test, and now you have to focus the last 35 minutes on a section that you're not strong in, you already have anxiety over, probably not in your benefit. So that might be a good break point for why to take the ACT over the SAT or vice versa. But science section, so in both the SAT and the ACT, the science is really about data analysis. Can you read a graph? Do you know how to look at a graph or a table? In this example, I picked one that has two graphs. Sometimes it'll be a graph and a table of values. Sometimes it'll be a schematic. But the questions come down to, can you read a graph correctly? Meaning, can you read the vertical axis, the horizontal axis? Can you see the intervals of how they change? Because they're not always changing at the same interval. And can you see the trend, right? So for this one, it's a linear function that's increasing over time, right? So whatever these two things are that I'm measuring against, I know that they're increasing over time. As X increases, Y increases. You know, if you're looking at something like this, again, looking at the axes and then looking to see, I have 3 line charts. And what delineates the 3, right? In this case, it looks like it's some sort of mass of something. So in this is a student pulled out 3 blocks in a straight line, pulled 3 blocks in a straight line across a flat horizontal surface. So this is if I have different masses of blocks and how that changes the velocity over time, or the speed. So for some of the students who come in and say, oh, I'm really not strong in science, you know, I've had a terrible chemistry teacher and I'm just terrified of it. Sometimes it's sitting with them and saying, hey, before we write this off or write your skills off on this section, let's just go through a science section and let me show you that it's not really your science knowledge, because the ACT science section is supposed to be written so that a student could come in with no science knowledge and still ace the test. They claim they give all the information that the student needs to be able to answer the questions correctly. If you can show them, hey, you know what, it's really just data analysis. Can you read a graph and can you see trends? And if they can, and if they get comfortable with that, then it might be worth them taking the science section. And the other great thing about that is it decreases their anxiety of like, well, I don't know about metamorphosis, or I haven't taken a physics class, or whatever it is. Okay, yeah, but this is really just, can you read a chart? Can you see the trends? Can you see that as one thing goes up, the other thing goes down, or vice versa? So the science section for me is often kind of fun and encouraging to get to, because we usually get to lower the anxiety significantly, because they realize, oh, all I have to do is read a chart. Yeah, I can do that. Within the ACT science section, there are different types of questions. So there's experiment analysis, there's comparison and contrast of scientific theories, where they'll say, Professor 1 says this about the Big Bang Theory, Professor 2 says this about the Big Bang Theory, and then the questions will be regarding like, how did they differ, how were they similar. I say that they write it so that you don't have to have any science background. It doesn't hurt if you do, because then you're not as intimidated by the wording. I've had students where they'll get like flush in the face when it's like a biology-based question or a chemistry-based question, and they're listing off organic chemicals, and they're like, what in the world is happening? You know, and I'm like, okay, just ignore the word. Like, let's just substitute a different word in for that and decrease the stress about it and see if that helps. And then they'll get to the questions like, oh, okay, it doesn't matter that I, can pronounce this organic structure. I just need to read the chart. And like I said, in the SAT science section, I would say it's easier in the sense that it's literally just data analysis. So it is just, they give you a chart in one of the sections and they say, based on the chart, what is, if I increase X, what's going to happen to Y? So if you can see, oh, okay, as X goes up, Y goes up, there you go. Does that make sense? I realize that as I'm talking about it, there's lots more notes that I could have added in. So I'm glad that we're doing this so that I can add in notes for next time. But any questions on this section that you guys, that I didn't cover, or that I'm going to assume no questions there. Okay, so before I take any questions on this, for us to just talk about what our next steps are to complete this whole SAT, ACT test prep certification. So the last step, so you've watched all 3 training videos, completing the math and science or English and reading mini sections, which I'm going to provide to you in an email after this. And if you guys can submit it to me by, that's next Friday, July 23rd. If you guys are traveling or on holiday or whatnot and we need to change this date, just let me know. I can be flexible on that. I just wanted to pick a date to where it doesn't get too far out in the future, because we actually are actively pairing people for SAT and ACT prep now. So there is an immediate need to have mentors ready to go. And then, so completing this mini section on your own, and then just like what you did with Heather when you guys were brought on at the very beginning, doing a mock session for an ACT or SAT, a test prep session with myself. If we can get that done by Friday, August 14th, again, that would be great. If we need to look at dates after Friday, August 14th, that's okay, we can look at it too. Just so I have an idea from the 4 of you all, can you guys give me a shout out of what sections you were thinking you could teach? We'll start with Meredith. You are still first on my screen. So Meredith, were you thinking you would do all of them or just focus more on the English and reading?
You know, I guess the English and reading, I'm fine. I'm comfortable with the science as well. I could try the math, but I guess I'd want to see more examples and take a look at the books before I would be on board with the math. But the other 2 sections I'm fine with. Most of the math I feel pretty okay with. I just need to look at it more.
Yeah, and I mean, you guys can tell this, we didn't do a whole section together. So there are math topics that we didn't talk about, and figuring out, okay, I'm really strong in geometry, but maybe I need to do a little bit more pre-calc or stat touch up. There's lots of resources online and whatnot. So, and a tool that I use sometimes for myself, but a lot of times for students, as you guys get into this and maybe you need a little bit of freshening on some topics, there's great resources on YouTube. And a lot of times if we identify a subject with a student where they're struggling in equations of circles or something like that, or circumference equations, I'll just type into YouTube, SAT, circumference problems, and typically there'll be 10 choices. So knowing that what we did today was pretty abbreviated in terms of the actual concepts in each of the section, I would encourage you guys to use all the various online sources as you're getting more comfortable in this. Okay, great. Monica, I've got I'm sorry, Meredith, I took note of that. Monica, what were you thinking you wanted to do?
I would feel comfortable mentoring in all of the sections. I do have a couple of questions. In those books, do they provide like the formulas and stuff that are provided with the test, or does that change year to year?
Yes, thank you so much for bringing that up. Again, another part that I should have included in here. Learning as we go. So the SAT provides, let me go down here. The SAT does provide equations, the ACT does not.
Okay.
So let me show you. Now, that being said, ironically, I've found that more often than not, students rarely reference these equations. So here are the equations that they give for the SAT. They've been the same for years and years and years. So volume, circumference, area equations, and special right triangles. More often than not, I find students don't refer back to this on the SAT, although it's good to know it's there.
I noticed that like most of the questions will give you, like if you need a volume formula, they'll give it to you in the question.
Yep.
Okay.
But the ACT, and I say that, the ACT does not give any formulas. However, I find that's the test where it's helpful to memorize some formulas. So like distance formula or formula of a circle, equations of a circle. And that tends to be, let me put this in here because I totally forgot to mention that. There are really great Quizlets that I will send them a link of or direct them to, and have them just go over those. Because yeah, there's always at least one, if not like 1 to 5 questions on the ACT math where they need to know the equation.
My other question is the mock session that we need to do by August 14th. Does that need to be in person or can we do that online with you?
You can do it online with me.
Okay, and then what kind of scores are y'all looking for in order to like certify us? Like what should be like our goal scores?
A perfect score. No, I'm just kidding. Not a perfect score. So that I would say above a 60th percentile. And also I'll include that in the email because I'm going to give you a shorter section.
Okay.
What am I going for here? I'm trying to do too many things at once. And I'll give more specifics on that in the email.
Okay.
Put the note here. Okay. Maddie, what were you thinking about teaching?
I think I'm pretty much comfortable with like all sections. And my only thing is I know the tests are similar now, but I remember I took the PSAT and the PACT, and something about the ACT like just doesn't click with me like at all. So I'd be like a little more uncomfortable with that.
Okay, great. I will put that on there. All right. And Katie, how about you?
Yeah, I'd also be comfortable just doing like the entire test.
Great. All right, that's awesome. I'm excited for everybody in this group because right now the majority of our mentors, actually all of our mentors, because Ramba rolled off, for test prep are only doing one or the other. So we have to pair usually 2 mentors with 1 student to cover the whole test. So it makes it a lot easier for everybody to just schedule with 1 person. So I'm excited that you all feel comfortable. And Meredith, I'm happy to work with you or set you up with Brenda, who's been doing the math prep for a long time, to help you feel really comfortable in the math, if that's something that you want to work on. Any questions? Good. Sorry, I cut you off. Any questions, thoughts, concerns, things that we didn't go over? I'm really thankful that we all did this together because I saw the gaps and stuff where I need to go back and add. So that's really good for me. Anything I didn't cover today?
Yeah, so I'm wondering, with those like 2 test prep books that you were referring to, is that what we like encourage our students to like use? And then also, do we have to get those books or how does that work?
Great question. I'm glad you brought that up. So the way that we handle that, so if the student hasn't ordered anything, then Julie, so when they first call us, Julie will either order it for them right there on the spot, and then we just deal with the payment through billing, or we encourage them to buy the specific ones if they want to buy it on their Amazon account. That's fine. If they already have prep books, then we ask them if they do. That typically is gathered in the initial information, and then what I would do is in the first session to see if those are prep books that we can use or not. If they're too different, then I would say just scrap them. And both of these books are under 25 bucks. So it's not a huge expense for a family to take on if they're getting private test prep tutoring. So more often than not, they'll have these books already, or we just get them to order them real quick. In terms of you guys having access to them, so we give these to you guys. So we'll give you a copy, and you'll have those as your copy for all time. And you can take whatever notes in them and whatnot and deal with them. And then if there's ever any disruption or like any time lapse between either you having a book or the student not having a book, for the SAT at least, many of these 8 real tests are the same ones that are on, let me see if I can bring it up real quick. SAT full length test are many of the ones that are online on College Board's website. So if I get past all of these, yeah. So on College Board's website, they have, you go down here. So they have 8, no, they have more now. They have 10 free tests available to the public. So a lot of times, if for whatever reason the student doesn't have the book yet, I will pull one of these tests and we'll do this together for maybe the first couple of sessions until they have their book. And I can't remember now which ones, or they might have gone through and updated all of these, but at one point, some, if not all of these tests were the same ones that were printed in this blue book. So sometimes, like if I had my blue book and I knew, hey, test 1 in the blue book is the same as test 3 here, then I could send that to the student real quick and say, okay, you don't have your book yet, but we're actually going to be working out of the same problems. I haven't gone back to check that in a while, so I don't know if that's still an accurate statement or not. And then the ACT, same thing. If you ever get in a bind where there's any lapse, if you go ACT full length, and usually I'll put PDF, that'll get us there quicker. The ACT always posts a full length test, right? So this would be theirs. Now, the test, they do like a whole, here's what the test is, here's what it's testing on. And so down here on page 12, that's when they actually start the test. So that's a great resource if the student doesn't have their book yet and you want to work on the same thing, or if you work through the entire book and you need some extra materials. If you work through the entire book with students and you've exhausted all the free online resources you can find, which is rare, but it happens, especially with students who end up taking this, 2 or 3 times, let me know. And then because I have other supplementary books that I'll use with students. That was a great question. Thanks for asking. Any other questions?
Going off of that, so is it appropriate to like does Beyond only recommend these sources? Like I remember I used Khan Academy a lot because it was free and it would like tell you what types of questions you were best at and worst at. Is that like okay to tell them? Okay.
I think it's awesome. I think the more prep, the better. And for a student who's really motivated and will go and do more prep outside, it's only going to help you. So the big thing, and I don't think I've repeated this enough, but it's just the more practice, the more exposure. That's what makes these tests easier. So yeah, Khan Academy, awesome. Like I said, I'll go on to YouTube. So like, let's say that a student is really struggling with commas. I don't know what is going to come up on my YouTube recommended. So let's just be surprised by that. And if I go to, if I say like SAT commas, oops, I don't think I spelled that right. All these things come up. So if I know a student struggling with it, I'll say, hey, in the meantime, I want you to go watch these 3 videos and then, and then do your English section. Totally fantastic. I'm all about use all the resources. This guy looks a little bit terrifying, but I'm sure he has great rules. Any other questions, thoughts? Look at all these grammar concepts, man.
I have a question about like assigning homework, about like how much homework is like appropriate.
Yeah, so the more the merrier, but I usually preface it with a conversation with the student. One, you'll figure out pretty quickly what's realistic for the student and what they're actually getting done. I think I mentioned this in one of the other videos, but I have a pretty stern talking with the parents and with the student of like, if you're not doing the outside work, don't waste your time and your money scheduling these sessions, because you're not going to see the benefit. And then you're going to be irritated with me or with whoever the person is helping them, because you're not going to see a big increase in scores. You're not going to see a big score change. So I always give outside work, and then I'll usually follow that up with a conversation with the student about what's realistic for their time. And I may talk with the parent about it too, because if the student's making up all sorts of lame excuses, then I'll be like, no, sorry, you're not getting away with that. At the least, I will give students about an hour and a half of homework to do, assuming that there's a couple days in between. I usually shoot for, probably the best way to answer this, I usually aim for at minimum 30 minutes of prep, like 4 or 5 times a week. They can definitely do more than that. But again, and maybe I'm too soft in this way, if I know a student is really taxed with a lot of extracurriculars and plays varsity sports and takes a lot of classes, we might be gauging it up or gauging it down depending on what they have going on, especially in the school year. If we're talking about in the summer, then usually we can go heavier, which is why we try and encourage a lot of students to start prep in the summer, because they tend to have more time. Does that answer your question? That was a really long answer. What other questions, thoughts? So we talked about homework, books. I think if there's anything else that I missed, I'm going to send you guys a follow-up email.
This may be like too practical, but when we're logging our training for today, is that pretty self-explanatory on the QuickBooks? And
yeah, you sorry, no, that's a great question. I'm glad that you asked it. Use the same coding that you would use for a mentor meeting.
Okay, great. And the time we're working on the test is just part of our certification. Is that correct?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm glad you asked that. All right. So if that is it, the nice thing is we finished 20 minutes before the 2-hour mark. So we didn't use all the time, which is nice. We all got a little extra time to go do whatever. I am going to get this email out to you guys with the section. So since everybody is interested in potentially all, I'll make sure to include all of the mini sections for you guys. Again, if those deadlines, if those dates that I gave don't work for whatever reason, or if you need an extension, just email me. It's not a hard or fast per se. It's just, I'm trying to get to the thing now. It's just more to keep us moving forward. Julie keeps emailing me. She's like, oh, we got to get some more test prep mentors. So we just want to make sure that we're ready for the influx. And then we will go from there, and we'll set up the mock sessions and go from there. So I really appreciate you guys taking your Thursday morning to connect, and I'm really excited that you guys are interested in providing this service. It's one where we get calls all throughout the year. So it's something that it's easy to fill up your schedule with test prep and doing it. And even as schools are test optional. Oh, this is something we didn't talk about. So you may or may not know that in response to COVID last year, college applications, actually all colleges made a test optional policy where students got to choose whether or not they submitted their SAT and ACT. Many of the schools, in fact, I haven't seen a school yet this year for this application cycle, so for seniors applying, that didn't continue that. So almost every school thus far is still test optional this year. Trinity, I know, made a 3-year policy, so they're going to be test optional next year as well. Regardless of that, I find that, so backing up a little bit. So in addition to the question of which test should I take, I would also anticipate a parent or a student asking you, well, should I take the test? Or when do I know whether or not to submit it? In terms of college advising, and I'm a part of an association of nationwide college advisors, and what is tending to be the break point of whether to submit test scores or not is if you're above the 50th percentile for the schools that you're going to apply to. Now, what came up yesterday in the discussion that I was on that I thought was interesting, and I didn't even put 2 and 2 together yet, but makes a lot of sense. The numbers are now very skewed because last year, the only people who submitted their test scores were kids who were getting very high scores. So the ACT is out of a 36, the SAT is out of a 1600. So, you know, the kids who are getting 1400s and above, or maybe 1350s and above, or the kids who were getting, you know, 28, 29, 30s and above on the ACT were the ones who were submitting their test score. So now schools, I was seeing like University of Pennsylvania, UPenn, their average ACT score as recorded for last year was a 35 out of 36, which is insane, because that's like 98th percentile scoring. So if a parent or student asks you whether or not they should submit, it tends to be judging it based on the 50th percentile, I would say, for the application cycle of 2019. Now, kind of my hard and fast rule tends to be if they're not getting above 12 or 1300, it's probably not worth submitting for the SAT. And for the ACT, again, assuming, you know, kind of general schools, not looking at IBs or some of the really competitive ones, we're thinking like a 27, 28, above a 27 or 28 to submit. I will encourage most, or almost all, students and parents to at least take one of the tests once. So just in case you need it, because we don't know. So we're usually working with juniors in high school. So we don't know if come next application cycle, if the schools that they want to apply to are still going to be test optional. So it would be really terrible if they just assumed, well, my school that I'm applying to is going to be test optional. They don't study or do any prep their junior year, and then they get to the summer of their senior year and their university announces that the test is mandatory again. And so now they're scrambling to take a test. So I highly encourage all students to take at least one of them and get a decent score. I'll give you an example. I have a student this year, he's going to be a senior, so we're also doing college applications, and he's just really not moving too much on his score, and it's not a great score. It's below a 1200. And so then the follow-up conversation I'm about to have with him and his students is maybe we should just stop the test prep and not waste the money and dedicate more time and money on the application part. So that's really strong, because I don't think his test scores are going to be the thing that gets him in. And I also don't think we're going to submit his test scores. So that's another piece to think through that we haven't really had to think through before, because 2 years ago or last year, it was mandatory wherever you applied to have at least one of the tests, and now that's not the case. So it would be worth as well having a conversation at maybe the very beginning, just asking, hey, what are some of the schools that you're looking at applying to? So that way you've got an idea of what type of scores we need to be reaching for. And I would say, if you are able to Google and pull up the 2019 test scores and use that as a gauge, and inform them that the 2020 scores kind of have an asterisk next to them because they're very skewed and lopsided because of the test optional policy. That would probably be a worthwhile conversation. And if they want to get into the weeds in terms of college application and that whole process, you can connect them with me and I will gladly have a consult with them in terms of the college advising piece and just talking to them about like what things to consider and kind of how to approach it. But that's something to think about for college, the test optional, which University of California didn't only apply to the University of California. They are test optional for life. They have a lifetime test optional policy that just came out. So any questions about that? I almost forgot to mention it and I guarantee it's going to come up. That's a new fun curveball. I thought of something to say that I just forgot. It's test optional. No, I don't know. If it comes to me, I'll email it to you guys. Alrighty. Okay, well, we will end there. So again, thank you guys for your time. I really appreciate it. I will get you these resources in the mini sections with specific information about timing and whatnot, and we're just going to use honor code there in terms of taking it and not using or any of the resources to answers, and then we will go from there. Thank you guys. I hope you have a great rest of your week, and we will chat with you soon.
Thanks, Laura. Bye.
Thank you.